Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant?
Say it, James.
I'm going to say it. What's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
One of our listeners, Damon.
Every time you start with one of our listeners, I want to crawl through the phone line and...
I've got to edit this whole episode myself.
Yeah, well, don't edit. This is the good stuff.
Keep this to a minimum. I really appreciate it.
I will, but you got to stop editing out the best stuff.
One of our listeners, Damon, who did not leave his last name, wrote asking me, and I've lost it, what did I do with his question? He says...
Welcome to my world, ladies and gentlemen.
Here it is. He says... Antony, I saw in the news that Kansas Governor Kelly vetoed a bill for a flat tax in the state. She said she couldn't support a reckless bill that would, quote, take us back to Brownback. I'd never heard of this until I looked up some history. There seems to be a huge divide as to what caused what. Can you shed some light on this? I had never heard the phrase, take us back to Brownback. It turns out she was referring to a previous governor, Governor Brownback of Kansas, and apparently under him there was a flat tax. Damon, I apologize because I did not look into the history of what went on in Kansas. Your question, however, did cause me to pull up data on the 50 states and to ask the question, among the states that have flat income taxes, this is flat personal income tax, how do their economies operate? How does it run? How well off are people versus other states? And just for a little bit of background, in case you're not up on this, a flat income tax means everybody pays a fixed percentage. So, for example, my home state of Pennsylvania was something like 3.1%. Everybody pays 3.1%. Doesn't matter if you're poor, middle class, rich, 3.1% across the board. That's a flat tax. Versus a graduated tax where the more you earn, the higher the percentage that you pay. So what I've done here, and this is not an in-depth study, I'm just looking at 2022, nothing special about the year, that's the last year for which data is readily available. For 2022, if we separate out the states that have a flat tax, and I'm including here no state income tax as well, because no state income tax is a 0% tax, it's a flat tax, right? So no tax or flat tax. Separate those from the other states. And here's what we find, interestingly. Real GDP growth, so this is a growth in economic activity. It averages over 10% for those flat tax states versus 9% for the graduated. So full percentage point difference. And you might say, well, 1 percentage point isn't that much, but it's 1 percentage point on a base of 10. So it's basically 10% more growth.
That's 10%. That's right. That's 10%. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it's significantly more growth. And you can ask the question, well, what's happening with the state governments here? And it turns out that the flat tax is indeed starving the state governments. And maybe starve is too strong of a word, but if you look at state, and I'm ignoring local here, because this is just state taxes we're talking about. If you look at state government spending as a fraction of the state economy, in these flat tax states, it's about 10%. So of all the spending that's going on in the economy, 10% of it is due to the state government. In the graduated income tax states, it's 12%. With the flat tax system, you got both significantly greater economic growth and a significantly smaller state government footprint.
So it's not starving government, but it sure is putting it on a diet.
It is, yeah. Now, there's all kinds of questions as to what causes what here, and we can devote an entire episode to that. But it's an interesting set of facts.
Maybe we should devote an episode to it, because I've got a follow-up question, and that would be to take a look at the flat tax states and compare them, 3%, 4%, 5%.
Right, yeah.
Because if you see it jumping from a graduated state to a flat tax state, you should probably also see it low to high flat.
Yeah, and that agrees with things I've seen elsewhere, that generally speaking, the smaller the government footprint, the greater the economic growth.
We have a pretty high income tax here in Arizona. It's about, I think, 5.1.
Is it that much?
Something like that. It is, but we have a relatively small government. You know, it's a desert-style government. It's hard to get a handle on it, right? Because I also, in my county, pay 8.5, I believe, on sales.
Right, yeah,
so
that's gargantuan.
It's not exactly a low-tax situation, and yet compared to every other locality in the country, it's not bad. And Arizona is always on that top 10 list of growing states.
One of the metrics I like to look at is total state spending, or in your case, you talk about taxation. Total state taxation is a fraction of GDP. You can get around questions about, well, are they taxing this or that? Is it graduated as flat? Just tell me how much money are they sucking out of the economy?
That's right. Because, I just told you the taxes that I'm immediately and visibly subject to. I don't know what the corporate taxes are here. And I would be subject to those. It just wouldn't be visible.
Right. You wouldn't be aware of it or consciously aware of it. Yeah.
That's right. Whenever you see a high corporate tax, trust me, you as the customer are paying that.
That's right. You're either paying it at the register, or you're paying it in lower wages, or you're paying it in less return on dividends or capital gains or whatever it is.
You're paying it literally every time. So when people say, tax the corporations, they're just saying, hurry up and tax me in a way that I can't see. I would rather be taxed, even if it's a confiscatory tax, in a way that I can see immediately, understand, and appreciate. That will inform my political behavior.
Politicians love this rhetoric about taxing corporations because it's a one time when you can get voters to cheer for the politician to impose a tax that ultimately the voters themselves are going to pay. And yet the voters are completely unaware of this.
No. There are 2 times. You might recall Donald Trump saying, I'm going to put tariffs on all those Chinese products.
Oh, right, yes.
Which is just a fancy way of saying, I'm going to screw you guys one step past where you usually get screwed. Anyway, we've got presidential politics to talk about in the main segment today, so don't want to devote any more time to it here. But, Ant, I do want to talk very briefly about a 50th anniversary that's occurring right now. And it's one of the most amazing things in my lifetime. It's the movie Blazing Saddles. It is, as of this week, 50, count 'em, 50 years old. I watched it a week or 2 ago, as I do, roughly every 6 months or so. This is high art to me. This is just an amazing film. The best social commentary about race that has ever been pressed to film. And Mel Brooks, when he made it, it was an open question whether he could get away with the bullshit that he pulled making this movie. And he has often said that if he tried to make it now, he would never be allowed to make this movie.
Yeah, he'd be canceled.
Because of all the precious snowflakes out there who can't wait to be offended by everything. I tried to look up how many times the N-word was used in this script. And all I could find was, quote, many. Nobody will even say how many times it happens. Because it's so over the top. And that was the point. You can either use that word never or 8 times in every scene.
Right.
And Brooks decided to go with the latter. And my God, was that ever the correct answer? This is a film, and notice I'm not even saying movie anymore, that is such an achievement in terms of social commentary. I think people should be required to watch it in high school. It's just that good. But, there's a joke. I watched Blazing Saddles on over-the-air television last week. It was 23 minutes long. Right, and that's what would have to happen.
Exactly.
Because the edits wouldn't allow any of the scenes to get through. I suspect there's not a single scene that would get through unedited.
Right.
I don't think there's a single one. And that is to our eternal detriment. Today's Super Bowl Sunday as we record. And the thing I've heard this year about the Super Bowl ads, the things that all the non-football fans look forward to, is that they're aiming to be inoffensive.
Didn't South Park teach us anything? If you aim to be inoffensive, you end up saying absolutely nothing at all.
Yeah, apparently not. This bubble-wrapped society that we have created for the benefit, near as I can tell, of young people who just can't handle anything that they're not equipped to handle. I hear now, look, I never thought Friends was a particularly good TV show, but now it's, quote, problematic, and no one will watch it. Seinfeld reruns are, quote, problematic, and people don't watch them.
Well, it's interesting you say this because I've noticed less and less of that. Go back 2, 3, 4 years, and there was constantly people talking about being triggered or this offends me or whatever. I hear far, far less of that today.
Sure, you hear far less of it today. It's because nothing's allowed to be said anymore.
Maybe that's it. I've got the causality the wrong way.
For crying out loud. So I'm going to keep right on being the regular James that I've always been.
The Jamesiest James who ever Jamed.
That is correct, which brings us, Antony, to the foolishness of the week. I have previously said that we are recording on Super Bowl Sunday, so you all have to know that the only foolishness of the week that's possible today is the Taylor Swift extravaganza that is the Super Bowl. For you, Antony, Taylor Swift is a young lady who sings songs.
I know that.
She doesn't sing them
I couldn't identify
well.
her songs, but I know she sings them.
No, that's the whole idea. You're not supposed to be able to identify them. They're so bone-chillingly generic. I'm going to say some unpleasant things about Taylor Swift. I think the music is a litany of banalities. When you peel back the surface, all you get is more surface. Now, I actually kind of like Taylor Swift, the human being. Mm-hmm. She's done very incredible things. She's figured out exactly what people want, and then she's figured out how to give it to them, which is the perfect entrepreneurial spirit. She seems to take pretty good care of the people who work for her. She seems to want to be a relatively positive role model. We could all argue as to whether she succeeds there or not, but this seems to be a genuinely good person. So I'm not picking on her for any of those reasons. And as a matter of fact, with the foolishness of the week, I'm not picking on her at all. But there are a group of people utterly convinced that she started dating the football player who's playing in the Super Bowl today, Travis Kelce. The political class took an interest in her because she's really a psyop, a psychological operation on the American people perpetrated upon them by the government in order to what? Get Joe Biden reelected.
How does that work?
Well, that's the interesting question, isn't it? Apparently, she is the most popular thing since bottled beer, and now it's getting even bigger, and it's the government that's making it. So somehow, the people who think the government is capable of great conspiracies are also the people who think government can't get anything right. This is just absurd. And the more I look into conspiracy theories, and I cut my teeth on these damn things in Iraq, they were everywhere. What I have come to believe, and maybe somebody can disabuse me of, but what I've come to believe is that conspiracy theories only thrive where people think themselves powerless.
That's interesting.
Which is why they were so prevalent in Iraq when I lived there. The people are relatively powerless relative to the ruling class. Right. Now, it's supposed to be different here, but as you and I have talked about for the last 10 years, no, it's getting less different year after year. And as the people become more powerless, I think you can expect to see more conspiracy theories, not less.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
This brings us to the main topic today, Ant. Well, before we get there, I should go on the record. I am a terrible prognosticator. I can diagnose things pretty well, but telling you what's going to happen as a result of those things, that is not my bag. So I went down to the casino and I laid a couple of bets on the Super Bowl, which is going to start in about an hour. And just so you all know, I had every game throughout the playoffs, so the last two rounds of the playoffs right, which boggles the mind. That's
really
a lot of games to get right. I didn't bet on them because I have no confidence in myself, knowing my track record. Uh-huh. But I did lay two bets on the game today, and it's too bad you can't go out and do the exact opposite because you might get rich. I took the Chiefs on the money line. I think they're going to win the game outright. And I took the over at 47.5. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. You can all make fun of me the minute you hear this and find out that the 49ers squeaked it out in a nail-biter that was like 10-7. Anyway, back to Joe Biden. And before we get started, Ant, I want to caution people, and we shouldn't have to say this, when we criticize Joe Biden, we're not endorsing Donald Trump.
And vice versa.
Yeah, and vice versa. I figured we'd get to that later.
We're strong proponents of none of the above.
Yeah, kind of. We've got a Biden problem here, Ant, and it's getting worse, not better. It came to light even more with that report that hit the other day about his cognitive abilities. He couldn't remember when he was no longer vice president. He couldn't remember when his son died, right? These sorts of things. And anybody who's lived with a loved one who had Alzheimer's knows these sorts of memory problems. I don't mind telling everybody my mother died with Alzheimer's. It's hard to say she died of it, but she certainly died with it. And for that last year of her life, I'm not even sure she knew who I was. And I'm the only child of an Italian mother, for God's sake. That's a pretty rare bird. So we've got Biden, who is becoming unable to retrieve basic information. He's referring to world leaders by other world leaders' names. He mixed up Egypt's and Mexico's the other day. He's telling us how he had a talk with German Chancellor Francois Mitterrand, which there's two things wrong here. Well, I mean, Mitterrand is dead and he was French. And you start to see these things. And when the report came out and it was damning to Biden, his people went into overdrive, the MSNBC crowd, and they wanted to turn this into a political thing, saying, well, clearly this is a Republican hatchet job. Well, I mean, all right, the guy who wrote it is a Republican. It doesn't mean he's wrong. It just means that he's a Republican. Now, does he want to take a chunk out of Biden? I don't know. He might, but he can only do it if he's right. And what do you do with a president who's very clearly losing his way, mentally speaking, who's up for re-election in months, who has a vice president that no one, Democrat or Republican alike, seems to want to see become president of the United States? This is a long list of things that are very, very wrong.
I'm looking up the favorability ratings for Kamala Harris. Do you know what they are? The last time I saw them was a couple of years ago, and they were just horrible. I mean, by horrible, I mean like worse than Congress's.
Well, I would assume they're not unlike Congress's. Congress is typically 18 to 24%. I would imagine Kamala Harris probably under 30.
Do Americans approve or disapprove of Kamala Harris? Looks like the latest rating was February 6th, 2024, so just whatever that was last week, a few days ago. We've got an approval of 37% and a disapproval of 53%. Now that's interesting because often when you see like an approval of 37, you'll also see a disapproval of 37, and then the majority are in the middle. That's not the case. The majority disapprove.
I don't know anyone, and do I live in a bubble? Yeah, I mean, we all do to some extent, but I don't know anybody who's up on his chair cheering for Kamala Harris to become president. Nobody wants this.
And why is this? So here's what I don't understand. I want to get back to Biden in a second, but here's what I don't understand about that. I'm looking at her disapproval ratings, and they're sticking around that high 30%, low 40%, going back to January of 2022. But she hasn't really.
You said her but you just said her disapproval.
I'm sorry, her approval rating is 37% to looks like a maximum 41%. Going back to January 2022. But she really hasn't been in the news. Why would they stick that low for that long if she doesn't have a high public profile?
I mean, if nobody can stand you, that's not going to change until you change it.
Yeah, you think it would moderate over time.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. Every time I see Kamala Harris, she's shooting her mouth off about something like gun control. That's not going to make her any friends from that group of people who are not particularly well inclined towards her in the first place, right? They give her assignments that I don't think she really wants. So, some of this isn't her fault. But she was quite awful long before she hit national prominence. It's hard to find a more ham-fisted law enforcement officer, and that's what she was in California, than her, who would put more people in prison for nonviolent offenses than her. Not a good person. But unless the Democrats do something and do it soon, we may see her as president.
Well, let me go back to Biden for a moment, because I read some of the stuff in the media about that report, and I couldn't figure out, was the report talking about his mental acuity as a side thing, or was that the actual main thrust, the purpose of the report?
No. The purpose of the report was that Biden, in his garage at his home, had all kinds of classified documents.
Right.
Sounds like something we've all heard before with the previous president. And the reason why his mental acuity, as you so eloquently put it, came up is that the preparer of said report got into whether it would be fair, just, reasonable, or even would there be a point in prosecuting him for it. And he said, given his mental limitations, no court would prosecute.
And that's where I've got a problem. And, let me underline, I'm no Joe Biden fan, but to give him his due, what I hear being quoted is basically anecdote. These are not the results of some formal mental tests that he was put under. These are just observations.
No. And we all know this man has Alzheimer's disease. It's clear. And saying that we have to wait for a doctor to tell us this, we will never have a doctor tell us this, because Joe Biden will go to Joe Biden's doctor, and Joe Biden's doctor will say, I do hereby give Joe Biden a 100% certified bill of good health. Go forth and be President, Joe. This is a man who's not going to make it through another year of another term.
We have two checks here. One, of course, is the impeachment process, but the other is it the 25th Amendment that his cabinet can declare these unfit?
It's the 25th Amendment, but it's way more complicated than that. Because of the complication, I don't know if it's ever going to work. Right? I think it's designed for this sort of thing. When a president becomes incapacitated, let's just use that word, for whatever the reason, this triggering mechanism exists. And it exists in a way that would make the vice president president or make the vice president temporary president. Mm-hmm. One of those two things. But it's triggered initially by the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or such other body as Congress may by law provide. Well, all right. What do you think that means? You got a vice president and the cabinet. Are they ever going to exercise this power? Especially in an election year. Do you think for 1 second they would all say, all right, we got to do something about Joe in an election year? That would be tantamount to saying, here, Donald Trump, have the presidency. It's all yours. Would
it, though? I don't know.
Maybe not, but that's how they would perceive it.
I'm not certain that the Democrats wouldn't prefer that Trump won.
You go back to this all the time, and I don't think it's right at all.
But hang on a second. If Biden does win, and if everything you're saying about his mental state is correct, he doesn't survive 4 years, at least intact, which makes Kamala president. And if indeed her low ratings are reflective to any extent of how people in the Democratic Party feel about her, the Democrats aren't any happier to have her in. So what does this mean? What it means is if Trump can get elected, he is going to be so stymied by political scandal. I mean, from day one of his office, there's going to be some question as to whether he should be jailed for whatever the past offenses are that are making their way through the court system. It may actually be to the Democrats' benefit to have him win and be a lame duck for his whole 4 years than to have Kamala Harris in.
On day one, he's going to try to pardon himself, and that's going to be an absolute fiasco. But nonetheless, it is my firm belief that politicians always want to win. It is also my firm belief that Democrats hate Donald Trump so much that none of them want him to win. And I think that governs their behavior towards him, to their detriment, actually. They would do better, I think, if they were not as crazy about it.
Trump winning would be very much a hoist by his own petard scenario.
Maybe, maybe not. And when you look at, his first term, he didn't really accomplish much. He did some damage. He accomplished some things, right, as you would expect. But it was not a successful presidency by any measure.
I propose he did one great thing, and maybe saying he did it is too strong. For the first time in a long time, I think people in the Heartland felt like somebody was paying attention to them. Now, it may have been a wrong person for the wrong reasons. We could debate that, but I think it's true that people in the Heartland felt that. And I know, coming from Pittsburgh, which is largely a Democratic area, they pretty much like him. Not to say, and let me back off on that a little bit. Not that they like him, and there are people who actually do like him, but largely they're happy that somebody was paying attention, that somebody was at least giving lip service to people's concerns who weren't living on the coasts.
And I give him some credit, and I don't know how much of it is due him or the people working for him, but nonetheless, the credit falls to him. I give him credit for nominating some pretty good Supreme Court justices. The Constitution matters to these people, even if it didn't matter to him so much. It matters to them. Are they perfect? No, but they're pretty good. Anyway, let's not make this about Donald Trump. Let's keep the promise we started with. This is about Joe Biden.
Sure.
What are the odds that the vice president would ever try to pull this trigger? And I think it's approaching zero, even if it would make her president. I think she would understand that, yes, she could probably become president by triggering the 25th Amendment, but she would be even more hated by the people in her own party.
Yeah, but at some point, she's got to look at her numbers and say, how much worse can it get?
Right. And that's where it gets interesting, because once the 25th Amendment is triggered, the president can, quote, transmit to the president pro tempore of the Senate and Speaker of the House his written declaration that no inability exists and resume his powers. So really, we would say, Joe, you're unfit. And he would then sit down and write a letter saying, no, I'm not.
And that's it?
Well, that's not it. Congress can override that. And then it becomes impeachment by another process. Right?
So consider this for a moment, and correct me if I'm wrong. Let's suppose for the moment that Kamala has her eyes set firmly on the presidency, which it seems that her rise through California's political structure indicates that she is very much interested in positions of higher power. A strategic thing for her to do is to bide her time until he's reelected, immediately trigger this process, and assuming she is successful, she gets 3 terms as president.
Can only get 2.5.
Only 2.5? Can you explain that?
You get 10 years max. So if you become vice president 1 year into a term, you can only stand for 1 more term.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Okay.
There's a bunch of things swimming just below the surface here. Yeah, I mean, she could play it a number of ways. If she wanted to be president, I think the easiest way for her to become president is just shut her mouth and keep right on being vice president.
Right, yeah.
The Democrats, on the other hand, should be shaking in their boots over that eventuality. If I were the Democrats right now, if they suddenly said, please tell us exactly what we should do to further our best interests, the first thing I would tell them is to get Kamala Harris off the ticket. Matter of fact, understanding that time is of the essence, I would say to replace her right now. Because if you don't, you're going to get stuck with that. Mm-hmm. I use that word knowing fully well what it means. And if I'm them, I got to get him off of the ticket too. Somebody else has to go on that ticket.
You know who would be right for the Democrats?
Oprah Winfrey.
No, Hillary Clinton.
I was thinking that just the other day. This is the time that Hillary's going to come out of dry dock. Yep. Not only would she'd win in a landslide.
Yes, she would.
Before the hate mail starts, please hear me. Please hear the words I say. These are analytical words, not hopeful words. I don't like Hillary Clinton at all. But you're right. I bet they're having that conversation with her right now. It'd probably be her with Gavin Newsom as a vice presidential candidate announced at the convention.
Well, you're going a step that I wasn't prepared to go. I'm assuming that they keep Biden as president. They bring Hillary on as vice president.
I don't think she would take that.
They'd be giving her the keys to the White House.
Unless they told her that he was going to resign the position at 2 years and 1 day, thus allowing her the opportunity to be president for the 10 years. If they don't do something, they're in big trouble. And we'll cover the Republicans some other time because they got their own problems. Alzheimer's not the least of them on that side, too. But Joe Biden hasn't lost a step. He's lost all of his steps. There's no joy in my heart when I say this. This is a terrible thing. It breaks my heart that anybody has to live through this. But he and his family are clearly living through this now. Personally, I wish him nothing but the best, and I hope he has a happy and productive life with whatever time he's got left. But he has no business being in control of a nuclear arsenal.
Well, that's a nice way to end it, James. I wish you luck on your Super Bowl bets.
We'll revisit those next week when everybody laughs at me about how much money I lost.
Either that or they'll be hitting you up for loans.
Well, I didn't bet that much, but you could always try. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person.
One person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.